Imagine a time long, long ago, in a place called Israel. The people of Israel were tired of being governed by judges and temporary leaders. They wanted a king, someone who could lead them in a stable and secure manner. And so, among all the men of Israel, God chose a man named Saul to be the nation's first king. If you want to know the lessons we can learn from this story that marked the people of Israel, stay tuned until the end of this video. Saul wasn't just any person. He came from the tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Benjamin was the youngest tribe and sometimes the smallest, but even so, God chose Saul from this tribe. This shows that God can choose anyone, regardless of their background or status. Saul was the son of a man named Kish. Kish was a respected and powerful man, but Saul, his son, was even more impressive. He was tall, very tall. In fact, he was so tall that he stood out among all the other Israelites. Imagine a man so tall that when he stood in the middle of a crowd, you could see his head above all the others. But it wasn't just his height that got people's attention. Saul was also very handsome, the most beautiful among the Israelites. One day, God gave a special mission to Samuel, the prophet who was guiding Israel at that time. Samuel was a wise and just man, known for being God's spokesperson. God told Samuel that the people of Israel wanted a king and that he had already chosen who that person would be. God then guided Samuel to Saul. The story goes that Saul was looking for some donkeys that had strayed from his father's herd. He and a servant spent days searching for the donkeys, but couldn't find them. Tired and unsure of what to do, they decided to go to a man of God for guidance. That man of God was Samuel. When Saul arrived at Samuel's place, something incredible happened. God spoke to Samuel and said, "This is the man I told you about. He will govern my people." Samuel then anointed Saul, pouring oil on his head, a sign that he was chosen by God to be king. This was an ancient custom that showed the person was consecrated to a special purpose. Saul's anointing as king was not an immediate public event. Samuel gave some instructions to Saul about what would happen in the coming days and how he should prepare. And when the time came, Samuel summoned all the people of Israel to Mizpah. There, before everyone, Samuel presented Saul as the new king. The people were surprised and impressed to see Saul, a man so tall and handsome, chosen to be their leader. From that day on, Saul's life changed forever. He was no longer just Kish's son, the tall and handsome man from the tribe of Benjamin. He was now the king of Israel, chosen by God to lead and protect his people. Saul's story shows us how God can raise ordinary people to fulfill great purposes and how obedience to God's will is fundamental for those who are called to lead. The name Saul means he asked for or a desired in Hebrew, directly reflecting the Israelites' desire for a king. For many years, Israel was governed by judges, but the people began to covet the stability and power they saw in neighboring nations with their kings. This desire was brought to Samuel, the prophet and judge of Israel at the time, who, being old and aware of his son's injustice, took the people's request to God. God listened and decided to grant the Israelites' desire by choosing Saul to be the first king. Saul, a tall, strong, and impressive man, seemed perfect in the eyes of the people, exactly what they had asked for. Thus, the name Saul not only identified the man but symbolized the crucial transition in Israel's history, representing the people's desire for a king. However, this choice carried a spiritual irony. By asking for a king, the Israelites were rejecting God's direct leadership. They wanted to be like the other nations, forgetting that they were chosen to be a unique and holy people. The name Saul invites us to reflect on our own desires and what we are willing to sacrifice to achieve them. It reminds us that God hears our requests, but also calls us to trust in His wisdom and perfect timing. Thus began the story of Saul, the king desired by the people, leading Israel into a new era filled with challenges, victories, and profound lessons about faith, obedience, and leadership. Saul was a young farmer from Gibeah, a small town in the tribe of Benjamin. He helped his father, Kish, by tending the herds and working the land. Saul stood out for his imposing height and his beauty, being described as the most handsome among the Israelites. His presence was striking, and he was noticed wherever he went. Despite his impressive appearance, Saul was humble and had no ambitions of greatness. His simple life changed when he set out on a mission to find his father's lost donkeys. After days of searching without success, he and a servant decided to seek the help of Samuel, the prophet of Israel. Samuel had already been instructed by God to anoint Saul as the new king of Israel. When Saul met Samuel, he was surprised to learn that he had been chosen to lead the nation. Samuel anointed Saul, pouring oil over his head, consecrating him as God's chosen one. Thus, the young farmer from Gibeah, with his towering height and striking good looks, was called to a grand destiny. Saul would become the first king of Israel, guiding the people through challenges and battles, leaving a legacy that would be remembered for generations. His story shows how God can choose anyone to fulfill his plans, regardless of their background. The Israelites asked for a king due to growing dissatisfaction with the leadership of the judges. For many years, Israel was governed by judges, leaders chosen by God to guide the people in times of peace and war. One of the most notable judges was Samuel, a prophet respected and admired for his wisdom and closeness to God. However, as the years passed, Samuel grew old, and the responsibility of leadership began to be shared with his sons. Samuel's sons did not follow in their father's footsteps. They became corrupt, accepting bribes and perverting justice. The people of Israel, already facing constant threats from neighboring nations, began to lose confidence in the leadership of Samuel's sons. Disappointment and frustration spread, and the elders of Israel decided it was time for a change. The elders gathered and went to Samuel at Ramah. With a tone of urgency and concern, they said to Samuel, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. We want a king to rule over us, like all the other nations." This request was a critical moment in Israel's history. Until then, God had been the true king of Israel, ruling through judges like Samuel. By asking for a king, the Israelites were expressing a desire to be like other nations, with a human leader who could lead armies and establish a stable government. Samuel was deeply saddened by the people's request. He knew that this demand was not just a rejection of his leadership, but also a rejection of God's leadership. Samuel prayed to God, seeking guidance on how to respond to the people's request. God said to Samuel, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you." Despite his sadness, God instructed Samuel to grant the people's request, but not without first warning them of the consequences of having a king. Samuel gathered the elders again and explained in detail what life would be like under a king's rule. He said that a king would take their sons to serve in his armies, take their daughters to be his servants, and take the best of their crops and vineyards to support his court. He warned that a king could become tyrannical and that the people would end up crying out to God for relief from the king they had chosen. Even after this warning, the Israelites insisted, "No. We want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." In the face of the people's persistence, God told Samuel to grant their request. Samuel then anointed Saul as the first king of Israel, marking the beginning of a new era in Israelite history. The Israelites' request for a king is a powerful reminder of how the desire for conformity and security can lead to the rejection of divine leadership. They wanted a human king to face their battles and establish a strong presence, but this decision also brought challenges and deep lessons about trust in God and the consequences of seeking human solutions for spiritual problems. God had already foreseen a monarchy for Israel, a plan that was recorded in the scriptures long before the people asked for a king. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, God instructed Moses about how the future monarchy in Israel should be. He provided specific guidelines to ensure that the king would be a just and godly leader, following divine commandments and guiding the people with integrity. These instructions were there for the right moment, showing that God had already considered the possibility of Israel having a king, but that this king should be chosen and guided by him. God knew that eventually, there would be a need for a monarchical government to maintain order and cohesion among the people. However, God's timing is perfect, and he had a plan for when and how this should happen. However, the Israelites didn't want to wait for God's timing. They were impatient and eager for immediate change. The increasing threats from neighboring nations, the the corruption of Samuel's sons, and the desire to be like other nations made the Israelites want to speed up the process. They no longer wanted to wait for the divine leadership that had guided their ancestors since the Exodus from Egypt. The elders of Israel gathered and went to Samuel, insisting that he appoint a king for them. They were concerned about the security and stability of their nation, and believed that a king would solve these problems more quickly and efficiently than continuing to wait for divine providence. They wanted someone who could lead them into battle, someone who represented power and authority. Samuel, knowing that this request meant a rejection of God's direct leadership, was deeply saddened. He understood that the monarchy was part of God's plan, but also realized that the Israelites' desire to hasten this process stemmed from a lack of trust in God's providence. Samuel prayed to God, seeking guidance on how to proceed with the people's request. God responded to Samuel, telling him to listen to the people's request, but also to warn them about the implications of having a king. God reminded Samuel that by asking for a king, the people were rejecting him, the true king of Israel, who had guided and protected them for generations. Despite Samuel's warnings about the consequences of having a king, such as the conscription of their sons, the taking of their crops, and the servitude of their daughters, the Israelites were determined. They wanted a king now. They didn't want to wait for God's perfect timing. They were willing to accept the risks and responsibilities that came with a monarchy. So Samuel anointed Saul as the first king of Israel, marking the beginning of a new era for the nation. This crucial moment in Israelite history teaches us about the importance of trusting in God's plans and His timing. Even though God had already prepared a monarchy for Israel, the people's impatience led to a series of challenges and lessons about divine leadership and human nature. The story of Saul and the choice of monarchy show how God is always in control, even when we make hasty decisions. It reminds us that, although we may want to rush God's plans, it is always better to trust His wisdom and wait for the perfect timing He has prepared for us. Samuel anointed Saul as king at a decisive moment in Israel's history. Picture the scene. Saul, a young farmer from Gibeah, suddenly finds himself in the spotlight. He wasn't seeking glory or power, but God chose him to lead His people. Samuel, the respected prophet and God's voice to Israel, poured oil over Saul's head, a symbol of consecration and a new beginning. With that, Saul became Israel's first king, a milestone in the nation's journey. Saul's kingship was quickly confirmed by a serious threat from the Ammonites, a warlike people preparing to attack Jabesh-Gilead, an Israelite city. The Ammonites, led by their cruel king Nahash, imposed humiliating conditions on the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead, demanding that each man gouge out his right eye as a sign of submission. Desperate, the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead sent messengers throughout Israel, pleading for help. When the news reached Saul, he was working in the field. Upon hearing the report, the Spirit of God came upon him, filling him with courage and determination. He immediately called the Israelites to battle, sending an urgent message throughout the country. Saul cut a pair of oxen into pieces and sent them by messengers, declaring, "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." The fear of the Lord fell upon the people, and they united with Saul en masse. Saul assembled an army of 300,000 men from Israel and 30,000 from Judah. They quickly marched to Jabesh-Gilead and attacked the Ammonites at dawn. The battle was fierce, but Saul's strategy and the strength of the Israelite army prevailed. The Ammonites were completely defeated, and the survivors were scattered, so that not two of them were left together. This significant victory solidified Saul's position as the new king. The Israelites, who had previously been divided and uncertain, now saw in Saul a strong and courageous leader capable of protecting and guiding them. After the battle, the people gathered at Gilgal to celebrate the victory and confirm Saul as king with great rejoicing and sacrifices to the Lord. Samuel was also present and, in an emotional speech, reaffirmed God's choice and reminded the people of the importance of following God's commandments. Saul's reign began with this impressive military success, which not only brought security to Israel but also united the nation under new leadership. The victory over the Ammonites was a clear sign that God was with Saul, blessing and empowering him for the great task of governing his people. However, this was just the beginning of Saul's story, a story full of challenges, triumphs, and deep lessons about faith, obedience, and the complexity of human leadership under divine direction. Thus, the young farmer from Gibeah became a celebrated king, chosen by God and confirmed by the people, starting a new era for Israel. And this journey, filled with decisive moments and epic battles, would continue to shape the destiny of a nation striving to follow the path laid out by the Lord. During his reign, Saul faced repeated conflicts with various enemies, especially the Philistines. From the start, Saul proved to be a competent and courageous military leader, understanding that Israel's security depended on confronting the Philistines. He organized and led several military campaigns to protect his people. One of the most famous battles occurred in the valley of Elah, where the Philistine giant Goliath challenged the Israelites. Saul and his army were terrified until David, a young shepherd, faced and defeated Goliath with a sling, bringing a significant victory for Israel. This event further highlighted Saul's leadership and David's bravery. Saul also dealt with constant attacks and ambushes from the Philistines, showing courage and decisiveness by personally leading his troops. However, the continuous pressure and his insecurities began to affect his mental health, making him paranoid and distrustful, especially of David, whose popularity was growing. The final and most devastating battle against the Philistines took place on Mount Gilboa. The army of Israel suffered great losses, and Saul, severely wounded, chose to fall on his own sword rather than be captured. This defeat marked the tragic end of Saul's reign. Saul's story is rich in detail, showing both his achievements and his failures. It teaches us about courage, leadership, and the consequences of decisions. Even amid his conflicts, Saul's life offers valuable lessons about seeking God and the importance of following his ways. During Saul's reign, he committed 3 major mistakes that had severe consequences. First, Saul usurped the priesthood. Before a crucial battle against the Philistines, impatient with Samuel's delay and fearing the loss of his soldiers, Saul offered the sacrifice himself, an act reserved only for priests. When Samuel arrived, he severely rebuked Saul and declared that his reign would not last, for God was seeking a new leader. The second mistake Saul made was his direct disobedience to a divine command. God, through Samuel, ordered him to completely destroy the Amalekites and their possessions. However, Saul spared King Agag and the best of the livestock, claiming they were for sacrifices. Samuel, when confronting him, stated that obedience to God is more important than sacrifices. This act resulted in God's definitive rejection of Saul's reign, and Samuel distanced himself from him. The third mistake was seeking the help of a witch in Endor. After Samuel's death and facing a new threat from the Philistines, Saul, desperate for guidance, consulted a witch to bring Samuel's spirit from the dead. The spirit of Samuel appeared and prophesied Israel's defeat and the death of Saul and his sons in the upcoming battle. This act of consulting a witch showed how far Saul had strayed from God, breaking all divine laws in search of answers. These mistakes revealed Saul's growing disobedience, lack of faith, and inability to trust in God. Each mistake marked a step toward his downfall, culminating in a tragic final battle. Saul's story teaches us about the severe consequences of disobedience to God and the importance of maintaining faith even in the most challenging times. After the prophet Samuel's death, Saul's life entered a period of great turmoil and despair. Saul, already struggling to maintain his reign, found himself even more lost without the guidance and support of the prophet who had been his spiritual advisor for so long. Samuel's absence left a void that Saul couldn't fill, and this was the beginning of his downfall. Saul became increasingly troubled. Without Samuel, he lost the moral and spiritual compass that guided him. His connection with God weakened, and his decisions were marked by fear, insecurity, and despair. This state of mind led him to make increasingly grave mistakes, further distancing him from God's path. Additionally, Saul was tormented by an evil spirit sent by the Lord. This spirit increased his anguish, making him paranoid and unstable. Seeking relief, Saul called David, a young shepherd skilled with the harp, to play and soothe his troubled mind. David's melodies brought some comfort to Saul, but they were only temporary solutions to a much deeper problem. David's presence in Saul's court brought both relief and jealousy. David, who had already gained fame by defeating Goliath, began to earn the admiration of the people and Saul's soldiers. This growing recognition sparked intense jealousy in Saul, who saw David as a threat to his throne. Saul's paranoia grew to the point where he attempted to kill David on several occasions, throwing spears at him during fits of rage. Saul's pursuit of David became an obsession. He mobilized his resources and men to hunt David, who fled and hid in caves and remote areas to escape the king's wrath. On several occasions, David had the chance to kill Saul but chose to spare his life, recognizing that Saul was the Lord's anointed. This contrast between David's mercy and Saul's relentless pursuit only increased the king's torment and disgrace. Saul's final days were marked by growing isolation and despair. His inability to find peace and spiritual direction led him to make increasingly desperate decisions. He distanced himself from those who could help him and instead sought solutions in practices forbidden and condemned by God. Saul's torment culminated in his visit to the witch of Endor, where, disguised, he asked for Samuel's spirit to be brought back. The appearance of Samuel only confirmed his worst fears. His death and the defeat of Israel were imminent. This final act of desperation revealed how far Saul had strayed from God and how deep his spiritual torment had become. Saul's journey, from his rise as Israel's first king to his tragic fall, is a powerful lesson about the importance of obedience to God, faith, and humility. His life story serves as a warning of the devastating consequences of disobedience and the loss of connection with the divine. Saul died in a battle against the Philistines, and his body was publicly displayed until it was rescued and buried by the men of Jabesh-Gilead. The story of this final chapter of Saul's life is both tragic and filled with profound lessons. The battle that sealed Saul's fate took place on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines, constant enemies of Israel, had mounted a decisive attack. Saul, knowing the gravity of the situation and already tormented by the evil spirit, was desperate. He had consulted the witch of Endor, seeking one last piece of guidance, but found only a prophecy of his own death and Israel's defeat. When the armies clashed, the Israelites were quickly overwhelmed. The Philistine archers advanced, and many of Israel's soldiers fell. Saul's 3 sons, including Jonathan, David's beloved friend, were killed in battle, leaving Saul even more desolate. Saul was severely wounded by the enemy archers. Facing unbearable pain and the inevitable fate of being captured by the Philistines, who would surely torture and humiliate him, Saul made a desperate decision. He asked his armor-bearer to kill him to avoid this dishonor, but the young man, terrified, refused. So Saul fell on his own sword, ending his life in a tragic manner. The news of Saul's death and that of his sons spread quickly. The next day, when the Philistines came to loot the bodies of the dead on the battlefield, they found Saul's body. They cut off his head and stripped his body, displaying it as a war trophy. Saul's head was taken to the temple of Dagon, and his body was hung on the walls of Bethshan as a symbol of shame and defeat for Israel. This disrespectful act did not go unnoticed. The brave men of Jabesh-Gilead, a town Saul had rescued from the Ammonites in his early days as king, heard of the indignity suffered by Saul's body. In an act of bravery and loyalty, they marched overnight to Bethshan, retrieved the bodies of Saul and his sons from the walls, and brought them back to Jabesh-Gilead. There, the men of Jabesh-Gilead gave Saul and his sons a proper funeral. They burned the bodies, a rare and significant practice, to ensure their remains were not further desecrated, and buried the bones under a tamarisk tree in Jabesh. This final act of respect and honor was a tribute to the memory of Israel's first king, reminding everyone that, despite his many mistakes, Saul also had moments of courage and service to his people. Saul's death marked the end of a tumultuous era in Israel's history. His reign began with great promise but ended in tragedy, illustrating the consequences of disobedience to God and the loss of faith. Saul's story is a solemn reminder of the importance of always seeking divine guidance and trusting in the Lord's providence, even in the darkest times. If you enjoyed this story and want to know the story of Saul's successor, King David, click on the video on your screen right now. See you in the next video.